Welcome, everybody, and thank you very much for coming to this meeting tonight. Our lead main speaker tonight, although of course he's looking forward to a lively discussion as well, is Chris Jones. He wrote a very interesting article back in 2000, which was somewhat prophetic in what he wrote. But I'm not going to introduce Chris because Steve knows him much better and has known him for much longer than I have. And so I'm going to go straight across to Steve to introduce Chris Jones.
Hi, comrades, and of course, welcome. And I'm very pleased to have Chris Jones as our guest speaker and reviewing this article which he wrote in 2000 on the English Republic. And to say that probably many comrades may not. We sent it around, but comrades may not have read it. But hopefully, after this discussion, if you hadn't read it before, you'll maybe read it. Maybe read it afterwards. I did say. To Chris later on. We're not assuming that you're going to agree with your article. We won't go on that assumption because we're having him reflect upon something which he wrote back 25 years ago. But I thought I would just say, as it were, just by way of background, I first met Chris when he wrote an article, and it was on the 5th of November, 1980, in the SWP internal bulletin. So at that time, a few SWP members, including myself and Henry Mateless in Scotland and Alan Armstrong, were taking up, as it were, the national question. And we were taking it up because in 1979 there was a devolution referendum. That devolution referendum was defeated. It led to the disastrous election of Thatcher. And in the wake of that disaster, some of us in the SWP, were proposing that we should establish a Republican faction, which we did eventually, and it had 40 members, so we got officially recognised. And we put a submission into the SWP internal bulletin in September 1980. And there was a reply by Alex Kalinikos from the SWP Central Committee. And then in the next bulletin, the November bulletin, to our surprise, because we didn't know this, there was an article by this comrade from Merseyside, Liverpool SWP, called Chris Jones. Here was Chris. And so it turned out that Chris had already been thinking along very similar lines to what we were thinking, quite independently. And when he saw what we'd written, he commented favourably in support of us against the Central Committee Central Committee member Alex Kalinikos, who later became the main leader. I think he's been forcibly retired just recently, but anyway, he was a leading member of the SWP Central Committee. And we formed this thing called the Republican faction, and I think I would say that Chris and Alan Armstrong, myself, and Henry Mateless were kind of the main four people around it. Within about 2 years, Alan and myself were out of the SWP, and we formed something called the Revolutionary Democratic Group. And Chris and Henry remained SWP members because Chris was, at that time, a Merseyside firefighter and became, I don't quite know when it was, but he was certainly the chair of the Merseyside Fire Brigade Union. And obviously, he was a well-known activist on the Liverpool left. And it made sense for him to continue to work in the SWP. But Chris was always in communication with us, I would say. Now, Chris retired from the fire brigade for medical reasons in 1992, and then he started as it were, a new career as an academic. And if I remember rightly, because I haven't checked it with Chris, I think he worked with the Open University, and I think he was also at John Moores and possibly Lancaster as well. I'm not sure. Maybe it was 3. Anyway, the SWP were a bit suspicious of Chris because for being politically too close to the RDG, and eventually Chris, I think, left them and joined us. And we get to the late 1990s when we were starting to work a little bit with the CPGB and with Alan Armstrong's Scottish group. And around about that time, 1999, we produced this magazine. You can see that they're called Republican Communists. We formed this thing called the Republican Communist Network, and this is if it's showing up. I don't know if it's showing up on there, but it seems to go blurred. I don't know why that is, but anyway, Republican Communist. This is the actual magazine in which Chris's article is to be located. This is the issue number 4, autumn 2000, and on page 20 of that magazine, which I just reread about a little while ago, and remembered how what I now think is it. I thought it was a good article at the time, by the way. Don't get me wrong, but I think I personally think it stood the test of time. But whether Chris thinks it stood the test of time, we'll see. But with no more ado from me, I'm pleased to have Chris here. As somebody who has, from a Marxist perspective, been a long-standing Republican, and I think in later years, Chris will tell us he joined came back into politics a bit more actively again with the Corbyn movement, and was active in the Liverpool Labour Party until relatively recently. But with no more on that, Chris, over to you and what you might want to think about your article on the English Republic.
Yes, it's so. First of all, the year I wrote this was quite an eventful year in a way for me, in that I began an academic career. So I spent from 1993 when I retired through to 1999 getting a master's and a doctorate. So I changed career completely, had a separate career, an academic career following, and was again a union rep in the lecturers' union in the old universities. So I had a complete change of career. So I wanted to start by just saying the article is oddly, it works well now. So Steve said this to me and I hadn't seen it and couldn't find the original. So somewhere along the line, I lost it on my computer. I've got stuff going back to that date, so I really don't know how I lost that particular document. But I hadn't seen it for years, so I only recently reread it, and I think it still works. But I want to, if you like, develop some ideas which I hope will allow a discussion around it, because I think there are some sort of problems, both with republicanism and with the notion of England and the English. So I want to talk a little bit about what those problems are. What's the problem with the English and England, and what's the problem with republicanism? I think the American comrades who are on this call might be able to tell me a lot more about the problems with republicanism, given that they are in an alleged republic with Mr. Trump at the helm at the moment. So the first thing to mention is not just in my own personal life, but the things that have happened in the last 25 years. Now, you could produce an extraordinarily long list, but this was written at the beginning of the Blair years in the United Kingdom. And as Steve has mentioned, there was discussion around devolution. And indeed, this time around, under Blair, Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland achieved some sort of devolved authority. Varying degrees of devolution with each different national group. And they have, of course, very distinct histories. So there's the history of Irish republicanism. There's a history of a much more developed national movement in Scotland. And Wales has, at least until recently, had the least developed national movement, although that's beginning to change. So it's not only Plaid Cymru now, it's also that you've got the Yes campaign, which brings in people more broadly on the national question in Wales. So there's change that's happened in that regard, but more broadly, there are things like the Iraq War. So when I'm writing about the Blair government there, this precedes the Iraq War, which killed any progressive notion. The Blair government engaged with the American regime, engaged with the whole war in Iraq, damned itself in the eyes of most progressives within the UK. Now that followed this article. You had then the Tory years with all the many prime ministers. You had the whole financial crash and the years of austerity from which we still haven't recovered. And Labour still now returned to government after that long spell, still really keeps the framework. It's not Blairite, but it still keeps that framework. And in the article, I described the Blair years as being a sort of new unionism, that the notion of devolution that was around at the time was very much that devolution was seen as a way to stop a national fragmentation, so that to stop the United Kingdom breaking up into its different national components. Now, so that's one of the things that's been a major change. The other, of course, is the referendum and Brexit. So when I was writing, there's an anticipation there that Englishness could become this reactionary form. And there's a little, in a small voice within that article, there is notion that, you know, British workers are not oppressed by Europeans. They wouldn't be opposed to Scottish workers or Welsh workers or Irish workers. That there's something that's fundamentally wrong around the notions that have developed around Englishness, that Englishness is seen as, you know, it's a way of getting out from under Europe. And of course, the people who drove Brexit through, their practice run, oddly, was about English devolution. So they ran a campaign in the northeast of England, which was the way in which they found the mechanisms they could use, and they deployed those mechanisms nationally in the Brexit referendum. So it's like devolution fed into Brexit in really quite strange ways. One of which was it was the practice ground devolution for the campaign that then followed on Brexit. Now, of course, you've also now had the Corbyn years and that sort of resurrection of the left. And I guess one of the things we could come towards at the end is where the Greens and your party fit into all this, in terms of a rejuvenated left and how they would fit in with republicanism. So, for example, I read recently Caroline Lucas's book, Another England, which is, you know, it's quite a decent book. I would recommend people to have a look at it. But that, for me, was a slight surprise. I hadn't really thought of Caroline Lucas as someone who thought about the different nationalities and thought about the English question. But she clearly does and has thought about it in quite some depth. So it may not be exactly the sort of notion of republicanism that we would have, or the notion of England that we would have, but it's certainly worth keeping like an eye on what's happening within the Greens and within the people around your party and how they work in this context. So let me start with some of the problems. One of the big problems, I think, is when was England? There's a nice little history of Wales, which is called When Was Wales, written by a Welsh Marxist historian. And it sort of echoed around the back of my head for quite a while, because what it made me think about was when was England? England barely appears in the historical record. So you have Alfred the Great, who literally imagines England, but he doesn't form it. And the imagining comes from, first of all, trying to re-embed civilization in an Anglo-Saxon context, in the context of an invasion by a heathen force in the Vikings. So it's a war context in which he imagines England, and it's his grandson that first unites the majority of little kingdoms that formed part of England at the time. So England forms out of that in the 900s. It barely exists, and it becomes part of a Nordic empire. So we have King Canute, who also is a Nordic king in Norway and elsewhere. So England flickers in the imagination, and it flickers as a form, but that's all it does. And shortly after that, you have a war essentially between different bits of Norsemen speaking different languages. And of course, the Norsemen, who'd by then learned French, then conquer England in 1066. So England goes from being this little flickering thing to part of an Anglo-French empire, where our laws are initially written in Norman French. They're not written in English, where the ruling class didn't speak English. And it's not until you get to Chaucer that you get anything remotely like modern English developing. So up to now, we've had this notion, you'll hear it said quite often, that England's been around 1,000 years. It's been this stable formation for 1,000 years. It barely existed. It then has its next flowering. And again, it's interesting culturally that people talk about and are, if you like, our historical imagination is coloured by the Tudors. Now, the Tudors, of course, are of Welsh origin, first of all, but England flowers under the Tudors. The English state speaks English. You have the whole Shakespearean development of the English language. There's a whole flowering around that Tudor period of England. Towards its end, Elizabeth I sets up the first imperial ventures, both in America and elsewhere. So in a sense, it's a reaction against the Spanish Empire. They bring I don't know if anyone saw David Olegas's Empire. There was a little fascinating piece in it where he traces the origin of empire to the British privateers stealing a boat. And in that boat, they found all these treasures, all this wealth, and they thought, we should have some of that. So the empire, what becomes the empire, begins under Elizabeth I. So you have I think it's the East Africa Company set up. So the mechanism of companies, which then expands into India and all the rest of it, that begins under Elizabeth I. And also the notion of planters, which is trialled in Ireland, is then transferred into the Americas. So you have this early origins, this flickering of England. Then you get this Tudor England, which is now very fondly remembered because it's England. Immediately she dies, we have a Scottish and English king who issues coinage with England on one side, Scottish on the other. So well before the Scottish Parliament is abandoned, about 100 years later, the monarchy is unified and the notion of Britain is generated. So that it's no longer England. Under the Stuart monarchy, it is already Britain. It's a Great Britain, which is Scotland and England. And then later, with the Act of Union, the Scottish Parliament is dissolved and Great Britain becomes the political form. It's also just worth remarking, by the way, that Wales was conquered very early on. But it's not until the Tudors that Wales is fully absorbed into England. So it's only under the Tudors that legislation goes through to abolish Welsh law and to make the form of political structure in Wales identical to England. So what I'm driving at through this sort of précis, this historical précis, is that England barely exists as an independent entity. And that's one of the reasons why there is the confusion. If you read books from the early 20th, late 19th century, people will often talk about England and Britain interchangeably. They don't really note that they're moving from one to the other. It's just a melding of the two, that England is Britain. Now, of course, England was never Scotland. England was never Wales, and England was never Ireland. So there's a problem in that. The English think of themselves as British. They think that England encompasses all the United Kingdom with all the different elements, national elements within it, but no one else does because they have separate national identities which persist. So in Wales, it persists in language. In Scotland, it persists in law. And in Ireland, it persists in a resistance to their absorption into the United Kingdom through a variety of things in the 19th and the 20th century. So one of the peculiarities of England is it barely exists. Now, there's a sort of couple of things you could say about that. One is that England, therefore, could be, if you like, re-articulated, which is, I think, the sort of project that Caroline Lucas favours, into a progressive England. Or you could say something else, which is, does it matter? Where it matters probably most strongly is the inheritance of empire. So as England fades with the Tudors and becomes part of Great Britain and then part of the United Kingdom, all along that, Britain is colonising huge tracts of the earth. One of the outcomes of that is the Windrush generation. Another outcome of that are the Hong Kong Chinese who retained British passports, but their passports weren't the same as other British passports. So the history of empire is intertwined with modern notions of nationality. So I know a lot of people find it difficult to think of an integrated Englishness. And one of the ways in which the far right have adopted and used Englishness is to do it to exclude immigrant populations, to exclude Black British, to exclude Asian British. Now, of course, another side note in history is that there has been a Black presence in England all the way through. So in the Tudors, it was quite pronounced. So under Henry VIII, there's one of the guys blowing all the trumpets behind him, glorifying him, is a Black guy. There are other famous Black figures in that period. There's a Black church in London. Elizabeth I signed off the bill from Parliament, which was to expel diverse blackamoors from England. Now, of course, they didn't, but they thought they might. But what that tells you was there was a significant Black presence in England in the Elizabeth I's reign. So that one of the complexities of Englishness and Britishness is that a lot of people who've come to this country find Britishness more congenial because it did encompass all the peoples of the empire at one point. They were all British. So people like to think, again, in the popular imagination, Little England, 1939, 1940, Little England fought with an imperial army, which was one of the biggest on the planet. It was mainly Indian, mainly from the Indian subcontinent. But English people like to think of themselves as being Little England, isolated on their own, with the Germans dominating Europe, forgetting that they had a huge empire covering large tracts of Asia and Africa. So there's a complexity with Englishness. And the complexity is that while Britishness is tied to empire, because it's tied to empire, it's also inclusive. Whereas Englishness has been mobilized to be exclusionary. So that Englishness is a much more narrow definition, or has been. So if we want to use Englishness, we have to come up with new forms of Englishness that are much more inclusive than the ones that have been mobilized in the past. Now, I said there's more than one problem. So that's England or Britain. Which are you? If somebody, well, when you write your nationality somewhere, do you write English or British? You can ask any number of people, and I've done it loads and loads of times, and you'll find some write English, some write British. If you ask them why, they often don't know. If you're in Liverpool, Steve and I had a comment about this. I live with all the time people saying they're Scouse, not English. They don't want to be associated with Englishness. And the claim is that we're all Celts, we're either Joneses or we've got Irish grandparents or Scottish grandparents. And there's a certain truth in that Liverpool is, like a lot of big cities, predominantly Celtic immigration that built those cities in the late 19th and early 20th century. But it's no excuse. You can't opt out, basically. One way or another, we live in England, and we're going to have to deal with it one way or another. But I do think it means a rethinking, a redeveloping. And that is a large cultural project. It is not a purely political project. So if you think about Englishness in the imagination, it covers things like folk music. So in the 70s, there was that whole revival around English folk music. But that gave a very different sense of Englishness to the narrow exclusionary Englishness that we've been talking about. That was much more encompassing, bringing other people in. So we need to look at a cultural bringing in of different peoples into Englishness and how that might be achieved. Now, I did say there's more than one problem. But one of the other problems, of course, is the notion of republic. So, in the English Civil War, when the monarchy was deposed, England became a commonwealth. So it was the English Commonwealth. And the revolutionaries in that period only forged a republic when they effectively unified with Scotland. I mean, I'm not sure the Scots had much chance of opposing it, which raises a slightly other question, which is the scale of England in relation to the other nations. So the scale of England has always been massive in relation to the other nations. The other nations are minor nations in scale in relation to Englishness. And presents another problem. An English republic would have to have relations with the other nations of this archipelago. It also would have to have relations with other parts of the world. And one of the problems I find with thinking about England and Englishness is that it eclipses internationalism. It eclipses what are the relations that England would have with the rest of the world? Would it want to be back in the European Union? Would it want to have other relations with other parts of the world? How would it defend itself? Any state, progressive or otherwise, a worker state or an ordinary state, would have to defend itself. How would it do that? What would it take from the existing armed forces? Would it have a popular militia? Would it abandon nuclear weapons? Again, if we're talking about an English republic, we need to be, if you like, more expansive than simply talking about a sort of narrow conception of England. We would have to take in the cultural aspects of it, but also the political aspects of it. Where does it fit in the international scale? And not only where does it fit in the international scale, in which states and what sort of relationships would it have with nearby states, but how would it defend itself? What kind of armed forces would you want? What kind of armed forces would be necessary to defend a progressive state from the reactionaries within the state itself or surrounding the state itself? So there's a problem there about the stateness, if you like. Socialists have to come to power somewhere in a territory with a government. And what we need to think about that in relation to what that would mean for future England. And there is, of course, the problem of republic. So republic in simple terms is an elected government, usually a representative government, not direct democracy. And it usually means no monarch, a constitution, and the legitimacy it gets is not like the monarchy where it's a fictitious hereditary notion. If you go 1,000 years, the monarchy, but if you go back, there's break after break after break after break. And all sorts of strange people get into the monarchy at various points. But there is that notion of legitimacy coming from birthright, coming from a long history, a continuity. Where does our legitimacy come from? How would we mobilize? What would the legitimacy be in a social republic? The legitimacy in a republic is supposed to come from the people, but that isn't sufficient. We see in the United States, even with this constitution, the notion of checks and balances, which in some ways flowed out of the English Revolution in the 17th century, that really hasn't even slowed Trump up, has it? It's, you know, all the checks and all the balances haven't checked, and yet they haven't balanced. Now, that may change in the next couple of years, but at the moment, I think it's a real warning sign that straightforward republicanism of the old school, that you just have a popular sovereignty with elected representatives and a constitution, is no longer fit for purpose. So we have to think what kind of republic we're talking about and what that would need to be. How would a government look? You know, we have models, we have various models from around the world. You have various attempts by socialists to design constitutions that embed popular sovereignty with a social dimension, if not a fully socialist dimension. Which of those models would we take? Or would we have another model? What would our model of popular sovereignty look like? How would popular power be forged, if you like, but not just forged, retained? Now, a lot of the things I've said up to now, one of the other things that I took from the article I wrote in 2000 was that there was a distinct focus throughout on the role of the working class in all this. Now, of course, one of the things that's happened since 2000 is the working class as an independent voice has been radically diminished in a variety of ways. And the sort of hopes I had that you could have a sort of an independent working class politics with its own agenda, that really hasn't come to pass at all. And again, if we think now to the Greens the way they are at the moment and your party, do we think that they are the embryo of some sort of regeneration of socialist and working class policy? I'm not sure that they are in and of themselves. So there's a big question. I think if anything, we've gone backwards since 2000. I think I was much more optimistic implicitly in what I wrote about the capacity for there to be an independent working class politics, even if that was quite a small minority, that you'd have in workplaces individuals who would argue these sorts of politics with their comrades, with the people they're working with. I'm much less confident now that they exist. During the Corbyn period in the Labour Party, people were more interested in fighting each other, to be blunt, than looking for who the main enemy was. So you had people, I think, in most areas where the divisions were within. And I think your party and even the Greens now are going to inherit that because people are going to come in having had several years of arguing with each other in the Corbyn era. So that they've already, if you like, put themselves in little boxes. And whether those little boxes can recohere into a broader politics, I don't know. I mean, one of the impressive things about the Corbyn era, one of the meetings I particularly remember, it was wet, drizzly, miserable evening. And Corbyn spoke outside St George's Plateau in Liverpool to a crowd of thousands. I don't know how many were there, 9,000, 10,000, that sort of figure. It was who was there that was impressive. You had mums with their buggies. You had people who'd never been to a political meeting in their lives. There were people I'd worked with in the fire brigade who just pitched up. They hadn't come there through any organisational grouping. They pitched up because they wanted to be part of it. And that's the sort of thing we've got to regenerate, that sort of popular movement, which draws in people beyond the organisational left, people who have a sympathy, but who've never been organised, who might not be a major organised person in the future, but may hand out leaflets, may come to meetings, will talk to others. It's that we've got to get back to, I think. And unfortunately, Labour is now in many ways in a worse condition than it was under Blair when I was writing the article. And it's still new unionism, if you like. It's not so new now. But if you look at Starmer's notion, it's the union flag always behind him. He's always tailing the right-wing politics of reform and the Conservatives. So the politics of 2000 are now within Labour much more reactionary than they were when I was writing that article. So that's another problem we face, re-energising within the working class. And I think that's enough for me, really. So I think now I want to hand it over for you to discuss.
Well, thank you very much indeed. The history lesson was fascinating, and you've asked so many good questions that I think we really need to throw the discussion open to the floor now. So if anyone would like to come in with some answers or some challenges or interventions, please put your electronic hand up now, and I'll bring you straight in. So I'm going to bring Mike Hope in now.
Yeah, but it's not by no means an answer. It's just a simple question based on what you were saying at the end of your talk, Chris, which is, I mean, it sounds great. I know the ground outside St George's Hall in Liverpool, and it is a great amphitheatre kind of a place, really. So to have 9 or 10,000 people there listening to Corbyn sounds amazing. I mean, if only he could have risen to the task, that's another issue. But my question is, would you see, as I think we do, the Palestine movement, the movement for Gaza, and all the things that have followed, and the mass demonstrations and actions that have taken place across the country, and that encompass a huge range of people beyond the usual suspects. Would you see them as being the equivalent of that crowd that you witnessed outside St. George's Hall?
That's a really good question, Mike. Chris, would you like to go and go for that one straight away?
Yeah, I'm not sure it would. And there's a number of reasons for that. Liverpool, the marches were every week. I think they might still be every week. And there are people who've gone every week, and I've gone occasionally, certainly not every week. The people who go every week are quite a narrow bunch of people and very committed and all the rest of it. And there's obviously an opening there. There are students who come along on that. There are different communities in Liverpool who have attached themselves to that. So it's had an impact, and it's had a broader impact than just the organisers of that. But it hasn't had, if you like, that sort of drawing in of people from the fringes, I don't think. It's done it in part, in pieces, in pockets, but it hasn't had that generalised effect that I think in the early days of the Corbyn era did. People were desperate for that kind of change and expressed it in their support for Corbyn. And like you, I have my doubts whether he could ever, or those politics could ever fulfil that. But the movement around him wasn't, for me, very fascinating because it drew in more people. The Palestine one, it's different. It's not, when you were talking, I was thinking of, is it similar to Black Lives Matter? And it's not. So we had the Black Lives Matter marches, and again, that was not fully generalised, but it was a different crowd, if you like, to both the Corbyn crowd and the Palestine crowd. So I don't think there's an equivalence there. So I can't quite think of a parallel to the current Palestine impact, if you like, not the war itself, if you could call it a war. It's a very one-sided affair. But certainly the mobilisation around it has been more in pockets than it has been generalised. I still go out like once every week or so with a bunch of retired firefighters, some of whom I work with. And I always think it's interesting to hear what the topics are that come up. And Palestine does come up, but it doesn't come up very often. And people are affected by it, but I don't think it's something that's radicalized them more generally. It's something they see at a distance, if you know what I mean. It's not something that they feel affects them directly. So I think your question is a very good question. I'm not sure if I've answered it very well, but it's a very good question. But I'm not sure it has that breadth and that capacity to draw in that early Corbyn era did.
That's that's very interesting because it's one of the things that we feel the Palestine question has brought people together, but you feel it doesn't, which is very interesting. So how are we gonna, what is going to be the motivating force, the adhesion force that is going to bring people together then? I've got a couple of hands up now. I'm going to bring in Gil and Peter. Gil.
Hi, Chris. Great talk. I'm in the United States, and next year is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It's also the 250th anniversary of Tom Paine's Common Sense. And so, as a different model of what is republicanism, universal and equal rights, an equal vote, which we in the United States don't have. And our relationship between nationalism and republicanism is entirely different. It's just the reverse. We had a separatist movement in the South based on slavery, which we fought a civil war over. So also happening next year is a new edition of Paine's collected works is coming out from Princeton University Press. And the chief editor is Gregory Clace, who you may know as an historian who's written books on Paine, Owenism, and pre-Marxist critiques of capitalism in Britain. So just as a perspective of where republicanism is, in the United States, basically, we're trying to develop the Chartist movement, arguing, abolition of the Senate, the presidency, the Supreme Court, and a single sovereign legislature as the form of republicanism, democratic republicanism. Anyway, that's just the view from the U.S., and it's a different situation. In some sense, we are so far behind even England in terms of how representation, about equal representation. Anyway, that's our perspective. But I really liked your history on republicanism. It's great stuff.
It certainly is. I'm going to bring Peter in now. Thanks very much for the American perspective there, Gil. Peter, I'm going to Peter Grant in.
Yeah, nothing very profound. I thought that history lesson was absolutely spot on. It was an excellent presentation. And I'd like to actually read your essay a bit closer to what I skimmed earlier on between the 6 o'clock news and the Northwest Tonight. But I think what I want to say is what you're talking about, the lack of or the way it's appeared in the political agenda at the moment, and the lack of a working class voice within the movement for Gaza, and the fact that the people, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign have actually mobilised hundreds of thousands of people on a regular basis, to the like that we've not seen before. I mean, we've had the odd mass demonstrations, like this, to stop the war thing and things like that. But for this major mobilisations to be taking place on a regular basis, and it is not the usual suspects that are showing up on those demonstrations. And I think that what we need to look at is the miners' dispute in 1984-85, where we had the politicalisation of that industrial dispute. Because I remember quite vividly going down to the pits in Kent and having political debates and things that were of a far higher level than you would normally get at a trade union event. And obviously that developed due to the fact that the miners were being physically attacked by the state, and were fighting back, and things were getting not a pre-revolutionary situation, but it was edging around towards that sort of scenario, and I think that that's the problem is on these Palestine demonstrations. Where are the trade union banners? I don't see many. There's the odd one. There's not a load of Unite banners. There's not a load of GMB or anybody else's banners. There's not even a load of ASLEF banners, to ASLEF's bloody shame. I'll be honest about that. But I think that that's the problem. The organised working class, as we see it, is not engaging. It's people that don't see themselves necessarily as organised working class are actually doing these things. And just on your comments about Starmer and his horrible crew wrapping themselves in Union Jacks at every opportunity, every press event, the Union Jack is there. They have to be sat next to it. Well, have you seen the bloody new uniforms that Great Britain's railways are going to impose on the workforce? Because I tell you this, I wouldn't ever be wearing that. It's an absolute disgrace, and I think the ASLEF and the RMT need to do something about it. So yeah, thank you very much for that, Chris. It was very enlightening.
That's fascinating, Peter. What are these uniforms that they're going to have to wear?
Oh, it's awful. It's a blue, dark blue, but it's got like lightning things across it, red, and it's made to, and I think there's, it's made to look like the Union Jack.
Oh,
That's
good
what it is.
heavens.
But it's so horrendous. I've never, I've done 42 years on the railway. Never anything like that ever occurred, was put forward.
Oh,
It's a complete and utter disgrace.
oh dear. Thanks very much, Peter. I've got John and Phil, so I'm going to bring John in now.
Thanks, Carol. Yeah, I think that Peter's combined with what Chris was talking about earlier to a very important pointer that defining the working class culturally, defining Englishness culturally before politically is really important. I put in the chat, I'm Anglo-Scots. I've never identified as English. And being a football fan who support a crap football team that's taken me through all 4 divisions all over the country, I have experienced time after time after time cultural regionalism, cultural localism, and to a large extent, the Palestine movement is the political expression of multiracial cities, multiracial big cities. It is not the expression of small towns where localism and regionalism are felt most strongly. And I really do think that if and when we embark on what Chris has said is a very necessary project, we need to recognize the split, the cultural as well as political split between large sections of the deindustrialized white working class and the multiracial working class in the bigger cities. We need to recognize that and incorporate that in the way we think about republicanism, in the way we think about Englishness. And we also need to recognize that regionally and locally, particularly in towns and in smaller cities, that localism and regionalism is felt quite often to the exclusion of an English identity that works for people and means very much for people. Now, this has begun to change because the right have moved into the political space, which was vacated a quarter of a century ago. And I saw it when I worked in Oldham. when by the Labour Party, as Blairism came in and aimed at the Middle England, as it was called, that demographic that can deliver electoral victory, and got totally absorbed in that. And we need to consider all of these kind of things if we're going to rebuild a concept of republicanism, which Gil has talked about from America and which Chris has talked about earlier. I think we really do need to rethink a lot, and we can't. I've always felt that some people in the RLEF have been a little too blasé about what for me is a real problem, and to think, well, we can redefine Englishness progressively. It is not easy. It is extremely difficult, and it flies in the face of a lot of the realities of cultural difference and political cultural differences in England. Thanks, Carol.
Thank you very much, John. Very, very interesting contribution. I'm going to go Phil. Phil has his hand up. Phil, I'm bringing Phil in now.
A couple of points up, if I may. I think the Palestinian demos did reach people and are reaching people that have not maybe been mobilized to go on other laborist or trade union demonstrations in large numbers. It's a question of what the workforce is doing, the professionalization of trade unions, the shift in how the Labour Party moved, as John has correctly pointed out. I would say it tried to be a much more middle-class party. It left via parachuting in MPs like we've seen in the northern towns and in the smaller towns like Stoke-on-Trent, for example. I know about the preponderance of people from outside these areas that the party centrally decided would be the kind of MPs they wanted, because they wanted a new Labour with they didn't want to have the old Labour tag. So people were pushed out and they pushed in new people who were not necessarily accepted by the local people. And gradually you saw Blair's votes fall over a period of time. This has left a vacuum which the right has filled, but the social conservatism of those so-called social conservatism of the people from those areas clashes very deeply with their political militancy in the 80s. And this idea that, what has happened to the miners, what happened to the miners' strike. I know many a nostalgic socialist sitting around in various hostelries in the south, in Thanet, where I live, mulling over their beer, what on earth happened to them after the miners' strike? How did we lose all that? I mean, it is a question which needs examining, and I don't say that flippantly. I think it is something which we need to understand. We need to understand why reform is making huge strides in my area, why reform is, and Tommy Robertson can get 120,000 people on the street preaching a kind of nationalism which would not have made it onto a lamppost in 1968 or 74, or a sticker on a tube advert, as I remember they used to try and put them up there. This has been mainstreamed. And we have to understand, I think, that there is a general, before we move on to discussing only republicanism, which is vitally important to this discussion, we have to understand what has happened to the collapse of a viable liberal democracy in its own terms. They can't even fight a decent battle in the mass media of their own. They've surrendered the ground. Look at the BBC collapsing with Palestine and Israel. Look at how it's collapsing with, brown-nosing Trump. Oh, everyone is. But that is Gil and Luke will know is not only going on here. It's something it's something we're also seeing in the United States. So I think there's been a loss of confidence in the liberal democratic institutions all over the West, really. If you look at Europe as well, the rise of right-wing parties funded by money from, I'm not going to start a row about this, but shall we say from questionable sources, but a lot of the money is coming in from outside. And as someone who lived in Italy during this for 15 years, I'm quite used to knowing about money coming from being used from other countries to fund both left and right parties. It was common then, and it probably still is. I wanted to just say another couple of things, if I may. Just to say, yes, I think those demonstrations are potentially amazing, but the fact is, as people have noted, they're not laborist. Palestine demonstrations are not laborist. They are something else altogether. And I think it's something we have to try and work out how we're going to reach that audience. And it's not going to be reached by trundling out 1945 social monarchism, as I and others in this group have characterized it. It's not a question of going back to Attlee and trying to reformulate what happened after the Second World War, because the conditions have completely changed. We had a viable trade union movement after the Second World War. We had vast numbers of people employed in public sector and public and heavy industry. That's all gone. So what do we do instead? How do we reach so-called Generation Z, that is anti-monarchist, that doesn't like a lot of what Starmer is doing, is desperately worried about where their future's going to be, where their houses are coming from, how they're going to house, are they going to be able to have children? Are they going to be able even to have a future employment which doesn't end up being precarious all the time? Forget about pensions. They won't even think about that at the moment. They're too worried about the environment, and quite rightly so. We of the boomer generation, and I don't say this in a general terms, I mean, the politics we eschewed in the 60s and 70s has not left a fecund ground to work on with regard to the generation that's growing up now, because they don't see a future. Capitalism here is not going to deliver for them. Now, they won't all go to the Reform Party, but some of them will. Some will go to the Green Party. But in the end, I don't see yet how unless we shake off the shackles of both Labourism and the social monarchy of the 1945 concept of what we're going to try and do, which seems to me to be largely still in the Your Party, although I hope it will come out of that. We have to look at a new attitude to what we are going to do, both internally, in domestically, in terms of our economy, democratizing our institutions, our economy, but also changing our foreign policy so that we don't carry on with this absurd fealty to foreign powers such as the State of Israel, who are to a large extent still deciding our foreign policy through the Labour Party and the Tory Party. And I don't think it'll change with reform. I hope that we will see a defeat of nationalism and a growth of solidarity socially, and a kind of new kind of politics which gathers around not just campaigning issues, but around accepting we need a new economy, we need a new attitude to the environment, and we need fundamentally a choice between barbarism and democracy. Those are the two things that we're faced with: fascism or democracy. Those are the two paths we have. And if you look what's going on in the United States, that is really quite clearly what they are facing. Is it going to go down the road to fascism, or is it already down the road to fascism? Or can democracy fight its way back? And are the tools of the 18th century sufficient to do that? I would argue they aren't.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely they aren't. Their constitution is not fit for purpose. I'm going to bring Steve in now. Steve?
Thank you, comrades. These are little bits, I suppose, of observation. The first point is I want to go back to this thing about republicanism, and I think it would be useful for us to contrast the idea of a liberal republic and a democratic republic. Now, the bourgeoisie has taken the term democratic republic to define France and America and Ireland and all the rest of them. They're calling it democratic republic. I think we'd be much better to use the term a liberal republic to define these constitutions and states, and therefore use the word democratic republic as something which doesn't really exist, something which is radically democratic. So in America, they're fighting against the liberal republic that is collapsing in the face of Trump. And they must, and it seems to me they're pitching around the idea that America should become a fully democratic republic with the various particular things that Gil was talking about, the fact you don't have equal votes in America, the fact you don't have a system of proportional representation, and many other things as well. So I think we have to wrestle the term democratic republic to our side and use the term liberal republic to describe these other kinds of republic, which are essentially bureaucratic and capitalist in their nature. So that's my first point. Second point, I think I take a point you've made, Chris, or we're making. I think that republicanism should be seen as a democratic and cultural revolution, not just a purely political thing, but a cultural change, a change in attitudes and values, not just a change in constitution. If you're going to overthrow the existing constitutional order and create a republican one, you're going to have to redefine what it is to be a nation, what it is to be English. We are rejecting our many reactionary, royalist, unionist values that dominate our culture, including the idea that England is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation. That is the dominant sort of idea, because we've never really examined Englishness. We've just got this white Anglo-Saxon. So if you've come to this country from abroad, let's say, and you're black, for example, the idea you can't be English. I mean, they said Rishi Sunak cannot be English. He can be British, because British allows you, because of the empire, British allows a black person to be British. So Rishi, according to Suella Braverman, Rishi Sunak is British, but he's not English. Rishi Sunak can't be English because he's black. So being English means to be white. It means to be Anglo-Saxon and Protestant. And if you think the Protestant bits are relevant, see how Tommy Robinson suddenly converted to Christianity. So they're going to revive the color of your skin. They're going to defy the Anglo-Saxon, being Anglo-Saxon and white. And that we're a Christian country. We're a Protestant. We don't used to talk about Protestant so much, but anyway, we are going to be we're on a Christian crusade. So the right are using all of that. So we have to be about redefining what it is to be English. And that's part of a republican transformation, is a cultural attitude and values about liberty and equality and solidarity and secularism. These are values that have got to be part of that. And I agree with what John said. That is not something we can do. It's a massive, massive task, a difficult task to do. But of course, then there are many other people out there all chivying away, including members of the Green Party, etc., and all sorts of people looking at this project. So I wanted to say a couple of other points. We'll come back to that. I think that it's important, and you mentioned this, says that there is a big break in our historical evolution from 2000, and that big break is 2007-8. I think the financial and banking crisis tipped this country into a different sort of epoch. We were already well on the way to dismantling the post-war system under Thatcher and then under Blair, right the way through, and creating this free market, including the free market in the City of London. And all of that blew up in 2007-8. And the state stepped in. And then the answer was to have even more of the thing that brought us to that terrible situation, having more austerity, having more neoliberalism, etc., etc. And so I think we tipped into an epoch that I've called it, and other comrades have called it, the degenerated social monarchy. We're in an epoch where the system is so broken that it cannot be resurrected. There has to be something else. And in the course of that, we've seen Brexit. We've seen the English nationalism, therefore, has suddenly come on strong when it didn't really exist. It came on strong, I think, as you already said, Chris, in the Brexit referendum, when Englishness was mobilised by the right to mobilise people against this foreign enemy in Brussels, etc. English nationalism was being used in that particularly reactionary way. And so we've been arguing that this period, therefore, as Phil said, will give rise to, on one side, fascism, on the other side, republicanism. And here's the mystery: where's the republicanism? It doesn't appear to be. So if we're thinking that republicanism is inherent in this situation, well, where is it? There isn't a Republican Party. there doesn't appear to be a Republican movement. We can see on the right the rise of fascism when 150,000 people marched to unite the kingdom in London with Tommy Robinson, all the rest of them. But we can't see the alternative. And I would say that, well, the funny thing is that Palestinian movement that we've seen is a Republican movement, because it's not a socialist movement, it's not a communist movement, it's not a trade union movement. It is about rights and democracy and self-determination and freedom, all those kind of Republican ideas. And it's about citizens coming out on the streets and protesting about what their government's doing and saying we shouldn't be doing this. It is about citizens' power, trying to get the power to change the crown from its policy, to turn the crown from its policy towards Israel and Palestine. And I think that is a kind of Republican movement. The thing is, it's not about England. It's not even about Britain. It's not looking to say that this movement should turn its attention to our system of government. If we want to do something about Israel and Palestine, then that movement has to think about this country, it has to think about England, it has to think about our constitution and indeed our system of government. We did have Tony Greenstein having a little dig at us for having this meeting, as Carol or some of you may have seen on that, saying, what you're doing, there's a hunger strike going, and why are you having this meeting to talk about this? Now, of course, you can do more than one thing at once. You don't either do, or we do something on the hunger strike, or we do this. That's silly, because many of us have been participating in supporting the hunger strikers anyway, as if we weren't doing it for this hour of the day. But to me, it's a kind of ignorance as well, that he hasn't noticed that the Crown is persecuting these people, that the Crown is carrying out this support for Israel, that the Crown is Zionist, that it's unionist, and it's anti-democratic. And it's the Crown, it's His Majesty's prisons, it's His Majesty's courts, it's His Majesty's system of justice. And therefore, the discussion we're having here, which doesn't appear to be anything to do with hunger strikers or anything of that type, is because we have to think strategically. We have to think of the big picture as well as what's going on yesterday, today, and tomorrow, which, of course, is very important. It is not to knock that, but Tony Greenstein doesn't make any connection when he attacks us for doing this, and he's completely wrong to do that. Yes, he should have suggested we could have a meeting on hunger strikers. Of course we could have, and he should have suggested it to us if he thought it was that important, which of course it is, So we have to join up some of these dots, put Tony, but he's not here because he doesn't come. These dots, the strategic, the future, the democracy, the constitution, how we're governed, and what we're doing in Palestine, and how we're persecuting these people who have supported the Palestinian people. These are all dots to be connected together, and that's what we should be doing. And I think that there isn't a Republican Party yet. I've come to the end on this point. It's not clear to me if the Green Party is a Republican Party or if it's committed to it. It's certainly not the case that your party is a Republican Party. It isn't. But then I don't think it's finally decided yet. So I think the jury's slightly out, is my opinion on that. But we need a Republican movement, and we do need a Republican Party. And we need to see Chris's analysis, which was absolutely excellent and still lives today. Thank you for Chris for coming and doing that.
Thanks very much, Steve. I think I'm going to go back to Chris now to answer those questions, comment on those interventions. So over to you, Chris, to give your concluding remarks.
Well, first of all, the discussion's been interesting to me. So some of the points that have been raised will make me think about other issues. There's the diversity of things. Some of the comments about the miners' dispute ring bells because my in-laws were miners in the northeast, and of course the pit went from a NUM pit to a UDM pit, and they had to go back to work in a UDM pit as NUM figures who led throughout the strike, and eventually left before the pits were all closed. So some of the after effects of the miners' strike one of the reasons why we didn't get much of it afterwards is that the people who led that were smashed. Literally, had their industry went, the positions they had within communities went. Some of the social clubs are there. I know a lot of them went and became the people who ran the social clubs, and for a whole time the political discourse remained, but it's died away. So during the Brexit referendum, the Northeast was notably one of the places that was very Brexit supporting. I had members of my family who were very Brexit supporting, where I was arguing with them. At one point, some of them came offline because they couldn't take the arguments. So this degeneration is widespread. It's multifaceted. I mean, unions formally are supporting, in many cases, the issues around the Palestinians. Not so much on civil liberties, but I think that is a point that should be driven home in the trade unions, because the diminution of civil liberties and the right to protest is going to come back to haunt the trade unions unless they get a grip of that fairly soon. And at the moment, I don't think they really are. But unions respond to pressure. One of the things that tells you is that there isn't an informal organisation at the base, because people aren't going to their union officials and saying, what are you doing about this? What are you doing about this issue over here? That's what's missing. And that comes normally from a social movement rather than one that's led politically. So we've had a degeneration, not just in the United Kingdom, but across the piece. So if you look across Europe, there's right-wing parties threatening to come into power everywhere. You've got a right-wing party in government in Italy at the moment. So it's not surprising. You've got the United States, Europe, and the UK all in a very similar position, because capitalism, since the financial crisis, hasn't delivered even on the basics. So you have people around you. Someone I was talking to only yesterday is facing a £1,000 bill for a root canal treatment. And it's like the canary in the coal mine, because root canal treatment was taken out of the NHS some years ago. NHS dental treatment is absolutely shocking now. If you can get an NHS dentist, that's the front runner of what's for the rest of it. So when I had my back operation in the 1990s, my vision of the future, if it goes like it is at the moment, is that you'll be told, we can put you on traction, we can leave you for months. If you want the MRI scan, if you want the operation, then you're going to have to pay the £1,000. Just as you now have to do for any complex dental treatment like root canal work. That's what's gnawing away at people. That's what's mobilizing people, both to the right and to the left. So again, when I go out with retired firefighters, some of them say what their sons are telling them. And their sons are influenced by the Tommy Robinsons of this world and the reform of this world. It's not, they're now dragging, if you like, older people in their direction. So that it's a large social and cultural problem from which the politics have degenerated, if you like. It's beyond the politics, the degeneration that's at the source. And if there's a correction to it, it will come from that too. Just as in the United States, Trump's ratings have fallen as his inability to deal with the economy has become more and more apparent. It's the economy that will make a big difference on whether there's a working class movement as opposed to a trade union movement. But it's only if there's a working class movement that the trade unions will respond. I don't know where that comes from. If it doesn't come, then I fear what we have next, because I think the right are the ones currently who have got the ear of a large number of people. And the left at the moment is thoroughly marginalised. Certainly the Republican and Democratic left is marginalised.
Yes, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think Phil in for a minute because he's got his hand up now. Phil?
Yeah, but I think briefly the problem that Greenstein has is exactly as John's pointed out in the chat, that he's in Brighton and that's a big issue in Brighton, Palestine. It's not a big issue in Thanet or Kent, as far as I can work out. Most people are not interested. They are interested in not having a dentist. They are interested in not having a doctor. But the solution to that is kick the immigrants out. And that is precisely where the left has failed. Social democracy in the Labour Party has gradually shifted to the right. It's tried to defeat the right by taking on the right's policies. As I say, things that were once on the lamppost are now coming out of the mouths of front bench Labour ministers. And we have a situation now where there is no chance of the Labour Party fighting coming up with a strategy to defeat reform. And therefore, it's really going to be a question of, can the left regenerate itself? Can the left bring the energy it's put into the Palestine question, which is absolutely vital, into dealing with the social crisis in this country? And I think you're right, it's canary in the coal mine. My father was a dentist. The lack of dentistry is a serious, serious problem. People are really, really fed up with it. But they're fed up with so many other things. Nothing works. You know, people talk about it here openly. Nothing works. There's no police, there's no this, there's no that. And the left has to think about how to get to what the right's doing. Populism is called that for a reason. It talks about popular problems. It doesn't provide solutions. It provides a response to popular discontent. And we have got to come up with something better than that. And I don't think that we are doing that at the moment. And I don't see quite how complaining about us talking about something other than Palestine is going to solve that problem either.
Thanks very much, Phil. Thank you. So I think we'll need to draw this meeting to a close. I think it's been a very interesting discussion. I think you've brought up some very interesting questions, Chris. I don't know that we found solid answers yet, but certainly you've given us a lot of food for thought. And we need to go away and we need to talk about this in our groups and our various WhatsApp groups and so on, because we do need to find that magic key to getting through to people how important republicanism is, and we need to do it as soon as possible. I think that's really, really important. So thank you very much, Chris. Thank you very much, everybody else who's contributed. It's been a very important discussion.
Well, first of all, thanks to everyone for turning up and listening to me. It's very kind of you to do that. I hope you do manage to read the article. As I say, I was pleasantly surprised that it still stands up. So I hope you'll get something from the article apart from the conversation that we've had here. Just briefly on the last thing, one of the things that struck me with what you just said is that the whole thing about the winter fuel allowance relied on a complete political cock-up from the Labour Party. What they ended up doing, they could have done at the start. They thought they were going to demonstrate their strength and powers by taking this away and making a case. So slip-ups by governments are very important in this, where they politically do something stupid, and then that allows us to mobilise around it. But that's not in our gift. It's taking advantage of the things that other people do that give us the space, if you like, to mobilise around that issue. It's not what we do, unfortunately. We have to react to what others have done in those cases. But thank you all for attending tonight, and thanks for all the provocative comments that you've made, very useful ones, and I'll go away and think about those.
Good. I think we're going to go away and think about a few things too, Chris. Thanks very much indeed. And to everybody else, thank you and enjoy the rest of your evening.